Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to the featured discussion of the documentary Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, written and directed by Deborah Riley Draper. It was March 2020 when I first saw this film and met Deborah and was just blown away. The idea of bringing it to the students at our regional HBCUs has finally come to fruition. Good morning. I'm Tammye Jones, an HBCU chair of the Essex County, New Jersey chapter of the Links Incorporated. Dr. Carmen Warren is our president. It is my honor and pleasure to serve as a facilitator with this dynamic group of speakers today. Represented on the call are students and professors from 16 HBCUs across 6 states, primarily in the Eastern area. Some of my fellow Link sisters are on the call too. This was no small feat getting all of us together today. Professors, maybe you received phone calls from me or emails from me, from Lacey Barnes, who's the COO of Coffee Bluff Pictures, or my fellow Link sisters. Our chain of communication is definitely working. Thank you, Lacey, for your countless hours with technology and communications. Thank you, Link sisters, for using your connections. And thank you, professors, for sharing this event with your university and your students. So we're going to take a slight pause right here because we have an awesome clip to share with you today.
Good morning. My name's Deborah Riley Draper. I'm the writer, director of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to share with you 3 minutes of a trailer from the film we've all been talking about. So hold on, and here we go.
I'm going well, but he's leaving it too late. That Negro's dangerous.
We're going to restart this. There we go.
The final of the 400 meters. Now here it is. Brown's in the outside lane there. Next to him, Williams, the American Negro. I'm going well, but he's leaving it too late. That Negro's dangerous. Williams will drive it home before they get into the straight. I'm going to fight for it now. The Negro's got it. 20 yards from the straight. Williams is ahead. He's going away. Brown looks weak. Roberts and Laval on the inside. Laval's going strong. Roberts is challenging him, but Williams leads. He'll do it. No, look. Brown sprinting. Yes, Williams of America. And here's Laval. Very happy to have taken third place.
This is one of the great tragedies of the story you tell, is you have 17, 18 athletes here who were on the world stage. One of them is remembered.
By the time 36 came around, people began to understand who Hitler was and what his goals were.
It was an opportunity on the world stage to disprove white supremacy.
I love my gold medal, but it's not, in history, it's not as important as their gold medals. Like, for me, there's just something so special about what they did and who they did it in front of.
These are athletes who did something really important at a seminal point in human history. Not African-American history, not American history, in human history. Did something incredibly important.
Simply being on the medal stand in 1936 sent a message.
From that struggle for legitimacy became the foundation of the struggle for access, which became integrated into nonviolent direct action and primed the pump for Dr. King.
They have stories that have not only drama and drive and power and force. For their stories that can focus us again on something truly important about the human spirit, about the human race, and what it takes to be truly human and not inhuman.
That was incredibly powerful. It really gets me when I hear them say that Negro is dangerous. I think we hear that today these days. Okay, you are in for a real treat today. We will explore how race relations have changed over 80 years. We will correlate the issues these historic athletes featured in the film today, then and how they relate to many of the challenges we face today regarding sports, racism, and activism. You've all seen the amazing documentary, and now you will hear from our two professors, Dr. Sinead Younge, who piloted this program, lesson, and discussion at Morehouse College in July last year, and Dr. Dexter Blackman, who is starting a newly developed graduate degree program in African American history at Morgan State University. And of course, the creative genius, writer and director of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, Deborah Riley Draper. All are here with us today. For the first hour, we will hear from the professors and then spend 45 minutes in a Q&A, including Deborah. So let's get started with introductions and move into the program. Deborah Riley Draper is the founder of Coffee Bluff Pictures, an award-winning filmmaker, motivational speaker, and ex-advertising executive. She is a 2016 Film Independent Lab Fellow and one of Variety Magazine's 2016 Top 10 Documakers to Watch. Olympic Pride was nominated for the 2017 NAACP Image Awards, and her book by the same title, published in 2020, is a 2021 nominee for the 52nd NAACP Image Awards for Outstanding Literary Work Biography. Deborah received an historic 2016 invitation to the White House from President Obama to recognize families of the 1936 Black Olympians after an 80-year snub. Today, Deborah continues to work her magic. She just co-authored a book with Essence Magazine editor Mickey Taylor entitled Force of Beauty, and just released another documentary that premiered on March 26 on Comcast, 20 Pearls, the study of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Be on the lookout for future projects as well. Dr. Dexter Blackman, PhD, is the author of the forthcoming book, We Are Standing Up for Humanity. Black Power, the Myth of the Black Athlete, and the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and the assistant professor of history and African American studies at Morgan State University. He has published peer-reviewed academic articles in Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, American journalism, and the Sports History Review, and co-edited a special edition of the Journal of African American History. He has also held research fellowships at UCLA's Ralph Bunche Center and the University of Chicago's Black Metropolitan Research Center. In addition to being a regular guest commentator on WPFK's The Beautiful Struggle, he is also a proud graduate of North Carolina Central University. Dr. Sinead Younge is an ecological community psychologist and the Danforth Endowed Professor of Psychology and Director of Social Justice Inquiry and Praxis in the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership at Morehouse College. Dr. Young conducts health research with communities of color and examines the social determinants of health. Dr. Young grew up in the Los Angeles area, and one of her proudest moments is losing a 100-meter race to the future Olympian Marion Jones. So I will now turn it over to our impressive professors. So Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first. Good morning, and thank you, Ms. Jones, for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, and good morning to everyone. Thank you all for joining us. So as mentioned, my name is Sinead Younge, and I'm really excited to be here. I first saw the film also over a year ago and fell in love with it. And so I wanted to learn more about these athletes that I just didn't know about. And so I got the book. And I reached out to Deborah Riley Draper, and I said, I just want to know more. And I was so excited and wanted to teach a course at Morehouse on it. And so we were able to teach a short course. And I'm hoping that's something that we can do again in the future. So I just want to thank you, Ms. Jones, and the Essex County Links and Coffee Bluff Pictures and Deborah Riley Draper for inviting me. And I also look forward to the discussion and hearing from Dr. Blackman. So as a psychologist, it's one of the things that we do, our main job is to study behavior. And so some of the students I know are psychology majors, and some may be history majors, or in all different types of majors. But it's really important that in order to understand behavior, we have to understand the context, and we have to know about the context. We have to look at the historical context in which that behavior is expressed. And so as psychologists, we often ask the question, is it nature or is it nurture? And this is an age-old argument that we tend to argue about over and over again. And it's no different as to when it comes to athletes. We often ask, are they born with this innate ability, or is it the environment that nurtures them? And I think some of you know the answer to that. It's often both. It's often both, but oftentimes people want to know, well, which one is it more of? And so what I want to do this morning in our time together is take a little bit of a deeper dive into the context in which these 18 athletes traveled over to Berlin. I want to talk a little bit about the environment that existed, even before they were born. I want to talk about the toll that the environment may have played on them and how they were still able to excel, even to get over to Berlin. What we have to keep in mind is that these athletes, these 1936 athletes, these are the children who were born and went through the Spanish flu, the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression, and they saw it all in their youth. And now they got to this point where they got to travel on this ship over to Berlin. And remember, I think one thing that strikes me whenever I watch these videos or whenever I read any accounts of their lives, these athletes were only one generation away from slavery. One generation away from slavery. So which means that they know people who were born into slavery. They knew their grandparents, perhaps some of even of their parents. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I think about this as a first generation college student, just all of the things that I, wasn't exposed to or didn't know as a result of my own background and the strides that I had to make. So I think about what are the strides that these athletes had to make one generation after slavery. So I'm so excited to talk about them, and I can talk about them all day, but I'm going to share some slides. And let's see, I want to start here with this picture of the women that we know as Tidy Pickett and Louise Stokes, who traveled over. And I think Deborah did such an amazing job of telling their story. And so the book starts out talking about their story and how they got to the Olympic Games, all the trials and tribulations that they faced to get there. And I often think about, I think about a lot of things, but I think about things like, their parents and their community members raising the money. And this is before the age of the GoFundMes. This is the age where the church community, the local community, the newspapers had to get together and tell their story and raise enough funds for them to be able to go. And it's a shame that we didn't know their stories. And so we know that yesterday was just the end of Women's History Month. So I just find it fitting that we start with these two women who made incredible strides just to get there. Skipped. So we all know Colin Kaepernick, and we know his story, and he is a hero, and he's done amazing things just to shed light on police brutality and equity and people being treated humanely. But the question is, who does history remember? We oftentimes, and I'm sorry that I blocked out one of the gentlemen to his right, we oftentimes don't remember those other individuals who were kneeling right alongside of him. So some of you may recognize Eli Harold to his left and Eric Reed to his right, even though I blocked out Eric Reed a little bit. And so oftentimes history, like what we've seen with the 36 games, we know about Jesse Owens' story, but we don't know the stories of those 17 other athletes. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we will always know Kaepernick's name, but we have to also shed light on the other individuals who were kneeling alongside of him. And not just these male professional athletes, we have to talk about the professional women athletes as well. So there's been so much press around the WNBA players, and I think they deserve so much credit for championing Black Lives Matter, pay equality, and just a number of causes. And keeping in mind, women do not get paid half the amount that the men get paid in professional sports. They don't have as much social capital. So in many respects, they had even more to lose. They didn't have this great cushion there. So I want to make sure that we remember these women, as well as the non-professional athletes. We had a number of high school students who also knelt, who also organized, who also made sure that they were moving the cause forward. So you students, you guys are the ones who are going to be telling your children and your grandchildren and your students these stories. So make sure you tell the whole story. So as I said, I want to take a little bit of a further, deeper dive into the context in which these athletes came to being. And both Deborah's book and the documentary a little bit touches on this whole notion of eugenics. So you have to keep in mind that there really was no such thing as race, really prior to the 1500s. So oftentimes you'll hear people say that race is a social construct. And what we mean by that is that humans are 99.8% or something like that similar genetically. So we're more similar than we are different. And there are differences like hair type, skin color, heights. All of these are just traits. And so the human species, this whole notion of race really came to be quite late. And again, like I said, probably around the 1500s is when the first mentions of race in books came about. Also keep in mind, and this is why it's so important to study history, that different groups of individuals, different ethnic groups had always interacted with one another. So Europeans had always interacted with Africans. And there's some evidence that Africans had traveled to the Americas. Ivan Van Sertima has a book called They Came Before Columbus. And so if you were to travel to Mexico and visit the ancient pyramids there, and you'd see some of the wall carvings, there are people who look like you and me on those wall carvings from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So there's always been some interactions of different groups who look different from one another. However, it wasn't really until the transatlantic slave trade began and got moving, that people started thinking about, well, how do we classify these groups? And you have to, the reason I bring up the transatlantic slave trade is because there had to be a reason why people wanted to classify groups. People always knew that there were differences. You could see phenotypically that people don't necessarily look exactly alike. But what the slave trade did is say, we want to now assign value to these different groups. And this is where we get into eugenics. So the eugenics movement is one that really did begin in Europe. And it started to classify people based on things like the perceived size of one's skull, one's stature, how tall individuals were, how short individuals were, and other phenotypic features. Eugenics is basically the notion that there are some groups that are more superior than others, and you could use science to try to weed out those traits that you don't want in certain groups. And so in the slave trade, there needed to be some justification as to why a whole group of individuals deserved to be enslaved. And the Catholic Church had a lot to do with this as well. The Pope actually declared that non-Christians could be enslaved. And we see that from there we had the Crusades and we had the beginning of the slave trade, with Portugal being at the lead of that. But it was scientists really from Western Europe who really started the eugenics movement and really started to assign value to different groups and say that there's some groups who are subhuman. And so there's a paradox here. The paradox is that how can you have a group that you deem subhuman, but also superhuman at the same time? And maybe that's not a paradox. So this is a photograph from 12 Years a Slave, which some of you may have seen. And it's Lupita Nyong'o. And if you'll recall from the movie, her character was lauded both for her beauty and her ability to pick over 500 pounds of cotton a day, which was more than twice the haul of any male enslaved individual. And so she was seen as superhuman. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were talking before we got started. Right now, we all are re-experiencing the trauma of George Floyd's murder. And so some of us are tuning into the trial, and it's very heavy. And what you'll notice and what you'll hear is the officers talk about how strong he was and how big in stature he was and how scared they were. And we've heard this time and time again, not with only with George Floyd, but with many other Black men and women, just this fear that officers have that something might happen to them because they appear so strong. And so these notions of eugenics, we call it a pseudoscience, has carried forward to modern day times in a way that has really negatively impacted individuals. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just show you. There was a study done in 2014, published in Social Psychological and Personality Science Journal. And it asked individuals about their perceptions of Black people. And Black people, again, for many individuals, may be perceived as superhuman. So the title of the study was something to the effect of a superhumanization bias in whites' perception of Blacks. And so some of the things that were said are, or some of the questions were, which person is more likely to have superhuman skin that is thick enough that it can withstand the pain of burning hot coals? And people throughout all of these questions said, Black people, Black people, Black people. Which person is more capable of using their supernatural powers to suppress hunger and thirst? And if you think about slavery, it was so intentional. And there's some books that describe slave masters would study how much food, because remember, we're talking about this system here. They would study how much food do you have to give an enslaved person for them to work. And so they would give them the minimal amount. And this should ring a bell for some people because this is very similar as to what happened in Nazi Germany. The Nazis were very conscientious of science and documenting. And so they would measure everything. And there were a lot of experiments done on individuals within concentration camps. So while I said that eugenics began in Europe, America adopted it, and in a way they mastered it. And so the Nazis ended up borrowing a lot of what the Americans did to Black people in this country, and they did the same to Jewish people and other individuals who they deemed undesirable. And so again, we could laugh at some of these questions. Which person is more capable of surviving a fall from an airplane without breaking a bone through the use of supernatural powers? And again, people said Black people, and this seems absurd to us. This seems absurd. We're all of the same species. Why would some individuals be more likely to survive a plane crash? But these questions were asked of adults. And we know that it has implications for how police officers interact with individuals, but also how healthcare providers interact with people. If healthcare providers feel like Black people can withstand more pain and are more likely to not prescribe Black people pain medication, well, we see what has happened with the opioid crisis. We know that it's impacted everyone, but we see that there's less cases of Black people being prescribed prescription drugs. And in some ways, we think that that may be why the cases of opioid addiction may be slightly lower amongst Blacks, just because of medical racism. And so, as I mentioned, eugenics really began in Europe, but America perfected it. And so Germans would come to the US and study the Jim Crow system, so our system of separation, and they were in awe of it. And they would say things like, how is it that you all are able to practice this segregation, but still show up on the world stage and say that you believe in the equality of all men, right? So they were just in awe of how Americans were able to do this. And so here on your left, you have a picture of a segregated water for coloreds and for whites, and same thing with the restrooms. And on the right, you just have, and I'm not sure what that sign means, but basically, the same system was being followed where they tried to segregate individuals in Nazi Germany. And, I think I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. She does a great job of detailing how Germany borrowed from the US. And at one point, she says that the Germans said, well, we can't do everything that the US is doing because they've actually gone too far. So if you can imagine that, So as I said, the world's eyes have always been on Black people for many reasons. And, this is a picture of Archie Williams, who's from the University of California, Berkeley. And as you can see, he has all of the cameras on him. And in the middle there, you have one of the filmmakers that Deborah talks about. And she just looks like she's enthralled by him. And so this just reminds me so much. We could even update this picture today of some of our athletes that are just constantly plagued by paparazzi and by individuals that are just hyper visual, if you will. I mentioned that Germans were really obsessed with measurement, and I just thought this was such a fitting picture. This is athlete Cornelius Johnson, who this is a photograph taken in the Olympic Village with his German competitors. And I believe he's about 7 feet or so, and he's quite tall. But you know, people are just amazed how remarkable. And I find it even more interesting that they're touching his hair in this picture. And I think many of us can relate when you travel overseas. You know, people are just intrigued by Black people's phenotype, and oftentimes they want to touch your hair. So there was a lot of discussion about these 18 athletes traveling to Germany. We knew what was happening in Germany at the time, and then president of the NAACP, Walter White, he really made appeals to the athletes to not compete, along with a number of other organizations. So in one of his letters, he wrote, "The United States has much to answer for in the matter of racial discrimination, especially against Negro athletes in the South. We ask the AAU to vote against participation on the grounds that Germany has violated her pledges against racial discrimination. And for the American athletes to participate would be to negate every principle on which the Olympic Games are based." And so Mr. White knew he was making an argument that would most likely fall on deaf ears because, as he says, we have our own racial discrimination in this country. And so he then goes on and he writes a letter to Jesse Owens. And you know, it's almost with a heavy heart that he writes this, because as we all know, whether we're athletes or not, the amount of preparation that goes into training for the Olympics and being on that world stage, it's a lot. And so, you know, Jesse Owens, a young man at the time, he writes, Mr. White writes to him and says, "I realize equally how hypocritical it is for certain Americans to point the finger of scorn at any other country for racial or any other kind of bigotry. Participation by American athletes, and especially those of our race, which has suffered more than any other from American race hatred, would I firmly believe do irreplaceable harm." And he goes on in that letter to say, you know, I know you've trained hard, and I know this is a difficult decision. And, you know, by all accounts, Jesse Owens did consider, at least he said he considered taking part in the boycott. But again, you know, he's a young man, and there's a lot of pressures both for him to perform. He didn't know if this would be his last Olympics. There was a lot of financial and emotional investment there. So I think it was such a difficult choice for these athletes. And I do think that many of them felt that by them participating in the games, that was their form of protest. That was their form of resistance. As I said at the beginning, this is one generation removed from slavery. And the rhetoric of the time of white supremacy and Aryans being the dominant race, you know, their very presence there challenges those notions. So for anyone who's played a sport or just for fun or you know, in school, we know that there is a lot of psychological preparation that comes into play when you want to participate and perform at your best. And I just think to myself, with all that's going around these young people, how is it that they were still able to perform at their best, whether or not they medaled or not? So I just think that the burden must have been so strong. This picture was taken back in 1964, so, you know, nearly 30 years after the game, but I just think to myself, this is a very famous photograph of a pool that was segregated. This is in St. Augustine, Florida. And the young people in the pool, like I said, were trying to desegregate it. And at that time, you know, the painstaking moves that people would make to keep people segregated. And there's some really interesting books and articles written about how people would have to empty pools if a Black person swam in it, and they would have a Black day for some people and a white day for others, or Black people could swim at the end of a warm season. It was just ridiculous. But this is the manager of the hotel in St. Augustine, throwing acid into the pool because these young people dared to desegregate that pool. And so this is in 1964, so you can only imagine what was happening in 1936, right? I think it's important to note that these 18 athletes who traveled to Berlin really set the stage for other athletes. In many ways, they were their predecessors, they were the forerunners. Without those 18 athletes, we would not have had these athletes who we know about. So I know some of you will recognize folks like Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Jim Brown in there and a couple of other folks. And I just feel like the door was open 30 years prior, where people understood that there's many different ways to protest. And sometimes your very existence in a space where people don't think you should be is a form of protest and a form of resistance. Again, we see athletes from 1968. This is a very popular photograph of Tommie Smith in the center and John Carlos to the right, who in 1968, that was their form of protest. And also Peter Norman of Australia. You know, he lent Tommie Smith and John Carlos those gloves, and they all, you know, they were all there to say that people had the right to protest, which they did. They did. And I think what's interesting about this photograph and about the 68 games is that Avery Brundage, the gentleman who really rallied for the African-American or the Black athletes to participate in the 36 games, he was still around in 68. And he called for Tommie Smith and John Carlos to be removed from the games for this act. And he called it he deemed it a domestic political statement unfit for the apolitical international forum of the Olympic Games. So Tommie Smith and John Carlos were removed. This is the same man, Brundage, who advocated for the US and Blacks to participate in the 36 games and didn't have a problem with the Nazi salute. So quite hypocritical, quite hypocritical. So as I mentioned, you know, those 18 athletes really did pave the way for the intersections between athletes and activism today. And I just have to nod to the WNBA players who really were at the forefront. And all of many of the players across various leagues were. But as those of us who, some of you may be based or from Georgia, know that Kelly Loeffler was running for Senate, and she was one of the co-owners of the Atlanta Dream. And her opponent was Morehouse graduate Raphael Warnock. And the WNBA across teams got the players to wear these Vote Warnock t-shirts, and we know what happened. Warnock actually won. Loeffler, who was known to pose, and there's photographic evidence of her posing with prominent Klans members, she lost. And her team, the Atlanta Dream, said to her, you need to step aside. You don't need to be one of the co-owners anymore. And one of the athletes from the Atlanta Dream, Renee Montgomery, who sat last year's season out to mobilize and protest for Black Lives Matter, is now one of the co-owners of the team. So that's a success story. So my question to you all in my last few minutes is, who gets to tell our stories? And I'm very thankful to Deborah and Coffee Bluff Pictures for bringing the story to screen, and also telling the story in the remarkable book. And so your question, or the reason I'm here today, is to talk about what was going through the minds of the athletes. I couldn't even begin to imagine, just because these young people did extraordinary things. And as you may have read or seen in the documentary, they went on and they did extraordinary things. And things that some of us may never know about, but we know that folks like Ralph Metcalf, was one of the co-founders of the Congressional Black Congress. He helped, or he wrote the resolution for Black History Month. We know Jesse Owens' names, we know other people's names, but just their very existence, like I said, is an act of resistance. And the way that they were able to do it, you know, we have to applaud them and know that those 36 games made an imprint on their lives and everyone around them. And it's those Black newspapers who told those stories. They didn't have Twitter or Facebook or Instagram back then. So it was those media outlets and those writers who told those stories. So I think I will end here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young, for the incredible presentation. It's so interesting when you talk about Avery Brundage, because the San Francisco Asian Art Museum just removed his bust from the museum, and obviously his major collection is there. So he not only participated in the 36 Olympics and creating complete racial havoc and doing it again in 68, but also in 1972, with the murder of those athletes, he said the games must go on. So his role in sports, he always ended up on the wrong side of history, and he purposefully placed himself on the wrong side of history. So with that, we're so excited to welcome your colleague, Dr. Young, Dr. Blackman, who's going to bring us a different perspective and contextual relationship between Black bodies in sports. Thank you, Dr. Young, and hello, Dr. Blackman.
Good morning, good morning. First, let me say I'm honored to be here. I graduated from the HBCU and I teach at a HBCU, and I did both of those things on purpose. So I certainly appreciate being able to talk to and chat with HBCU students, personnel, and other supporters of those institutions. So what I want to talk about today is the meaning of Black athletes, particularly in Black communities. To give more background about why Jesse Owens and those other 17, 18 Black Olympians meant so much in 1936. It's a contested meaning. And by looking at those contested meanings and how they were contested, particularly within the Black community, but also in other places, I think we can learn a lot about Black advancement. In other words, about how Black people tried to make an argument for their citizenship and humanity. So I'm gonna look at that in the first half of the 20th century and look at Black athletes' roles in that. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. I'm assuming that everyone can see my screen. If not, I'm sure my colleagues will let me know. Okay. So by the 1890s, the United States was engaged in imperialism, competing with other world powers like Germany and England, and to a lesser degree, Japan and Russia, for control of local and global economics. These geopolitical struggles often led to military conflicts such as the Spanish-American War in 1896. Now, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that imperialism was all about economic control, but it was often rationalized by these notions of race and civilization. And so this map shows that by 1903, that the United States was totally dominating the Caribbean, but also had these possessions in places like South America, beginning into Asia and also Africa. And again, this is all about global and economic control, but it was rationalized by something called civilization. And civilization at this time was this argument that civilization, and for short, we'll call it the Western socialization of all man's society, was advanced through the conflict of the races or other groups. According to people like President Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the turn of the century or in 1901, American civilization advanced because of the superior legacy of manliness that Americans had. And manliness was these number of kind of characteristic moral and physical traits that Americans were said to have. And so, although Black folks understood the inherent racism in this concept of civilization, they also saw it as a means to acquire their citizenship. In other words, they would participate in the colonization and imperializing other nations, therefore showing that they were manly and therefore earning their citizenship. So as early as the 1890s, you saw Black schools like Howard University, Fisk, begin to incorporate ROTC on their campuses, training men to go participate in the American mission of colonization and imperialism. Now, from the beginning, Black periodicals basically made the argument that these men were representing all Black people, and as a result of demonstrating manliness, they were acquiring citizenship rights for all people. So I'll go to the next screen. Now, President Theodore Roosevelt was a serious advocate of manliness. And he was also a serious advocate of athletics. Roosevelt, along with William Randolph Hearst, who basically is the owner, the forerunner of what we know as the modern New York Times, they both advocated athletics because the United States did not have mandatory military service or compulsory military service. So in the absence of that, they argued that organized athletics got men physically and mentally ready to join the military, to compete in imperialism. So Roosevelt led an effort in 1903 to actually save college football after several young men had died in the sport in the 4 or 5 years previously. So he was a serious advocate of that. So that reaches all the way up to the White House. And one of the things that comes out of that is that athletics receives a serious endorsement. And you also see that development on African-American campuses as well. By the time the 1890s end, virtually all Black colleges, except for the very smallest, have new football and new baseball teams. Some have track, but that will come a little bit later on. And by the 1920s, you can see Black newspapers pointing out examples of Black college stars, whether at HBCUs or whether at predominantly white institutions, as evidence of manliness. In 1933, a very well thought of former Negro League baseball player and newspaper editor named Elmer Carter wrote that the inclusion of Blacks on predominantly white teams refuted this notion, this bad racist myth that Black folk lack the masculine and moral qualities of stamina, skill, and courage. This was also the case when it came to Charles H. Williams, who was the athletic director and basically the director of the CIAA. One of the things that Charles Williams argued is that he said flat out that Black athletes represented manliness. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about this photograph here, this is a photograph of the 1912 North Carolina A&T football team. And if you look at it to your left, and I'm assuming that you're seeing the photo just the way that I am, to your far left, you see a gentleman in a military uniform. And in the back to the far left, you see another gentleman in the military uniform. And definitely one of the things that's going on here is that football is being equated to making men the same way that the military makes men. It would be kind of disrespectful otherwise for them to wear their uniform in this kind of football team photo, but they're wearing their uniform. And that's because early in the 20th century, it was kind of an open knowledge that athletics cultivated these kind of moral as well as physical characteristics that made you men. And so this photograph is showing off that North Carolina A&T, and you can expand it, that all Black or many Black colleges understand the priority of making men who will push the nation forward and how that will earn Black people citizenship rights. And this is the kind of things that Charles H. Williams and other people in the CIAA, and we'll talk more about the CIAA in a minute, were talking about when they talked about how sports help create men and how that pushed Black advancement forwards. Charles H. Williams also talked extensively about Blacks at the 1932 Olympics. Here you see a photograph of Eddie Tolan and Ralph Metcalf and also a gentleman in the middle. And they were able to win first and second in the 100 meters at the 1932 games. And Charles H. Williams said that it was perhaps the greatest accomplishment by Blacks in 1932 because it demonstrated Black folks' manliness. Now, this idea about what constituted manliness, provoked a debate in the Black community. In 1932, you would have a number of Black sprinters and Black boxers who would arrive on the national scene, and by expansion onto the international team. And so there was a debate about just how well these athletes were representing representing Black America, and exactly was it a good thing? And there were people like Arthur Howe, who ironically was the president of Hampton University, and by extension, he was Charles H. Williams' boss. And he made the argument that these 1932 Olympians and other athletes, they represented the idea that morally African Americans were improving. And this was a big deal. Since Reconstruction, or since the fall of Reconstruction in 1877, when the government bailed on protecting African American rights, one of the arguments that African Americans made was that they were a middle-class, civilized people. And even though they didn't have the money to prove that they were middle class, they had the character and the manners to prove that they were middle class. And so character was a huge thing coming into what we call the industrial age. Those people who had character, those people who were honest, those people who were pious, those people who had a strong work ethic, those people who were morally sound were the people who supposedly succeeded in society. And so what Arthur Howe said is that you have the evolution of Black athletes who can participate on an international stage because morally Black people have improved themselves. This notion of physical manliness comes way second. So you see very early on that this debate is being contested. What is the meaning of these Black athletes in the Black community? What is the meaning of these Black athletes in the Black community? Now, that meaning would be fleshed out with the 1936 Olympics. That meaning would certainly be fleshed out with the 1936 Olympics. One of the early ways that it would be fleshed out was in 1933, Germany came to power. The Nazis came to power in Germany. And there was a huge debate in the West, and that includes the United States and Europe, about whether to participate in the Olympic Games. The Nazis had these anti-Semitic policies that by 1935 that had all but stripped German Jews of their human rights inside the country. And so a lot of countries wanted to pull their Olympic teams from going to the games. African Americans got seriously involved in this debate. Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, and at that time, that makes him extremely significant. That makes him one of the leading voices in the Black community, called for African Americans to participate in this debate. Walter White looked at it in this way, that this was a chance to highlight discrimination, even if it wasn't against African Americans. So by highlighting discrimination, it could only further the cause of African Americans. Then you also had a number of Garveyites who took a race-first position, and they argued that you just simply needed to protest racism where it was. However, what's astonishing about it is the majority of the Black press, particularly by 1935, with the emergence of Jesse Owens, argued for participation in the games. They argued that African Americans could go over, win medals, and that would be more effective. That would be more effective in advancing Black Americans than simply boycotting the games. Now, the African American debate really had no influence on the larger discussion. But what comes out of this discussion is that by 1935, on the eve of the 1936 Olympic Games, there was a solid consensus in the African American community that these Black athletes represented a show of masculinity and manliness that seemed to be more important than these notions of character. And just to sum it up, to give you a really good summary of it, the Crisis, which is the NAACP's race journal, or what we would call magazine today, contradicted by contradicted Walter White, its quote unquote executive director, by simply saying the beautiful thud of Joe Louis upside a white person's head was more interracial education than character. So clearly African Americans by 1935 wanted to participate in the games. And so I'll show you this picture of Owens and Lewis. And I just have to admit that I chose this picture because of how well dressed they are. There are two other pictures that show them together that are commonly used. But this is a 1938 publicity photo. And I don't know that you see publicity photos like this of athletes today, but clearly I think it's an indication of how well known Joe Louis and Jesse Owens have become by 1938. Just as a brief recap, at the 1936 games in Germany, Owens wins 4 medals. In 1937, Joe Louis wins the world heavyweight title, becoming the first African-American to hold that title in about 22 years. And in 1938, just so we understand it, in 1938, Joe Louis defeats Max Melling, who is a German and former world's heavyweight champion. And the mainstream media paints Melling as a representative of Nazi Germany. So Joe Louis's victory in 1938 is really celebrated as a victory over Germany, someone that a nation that most Americans speculate the United States will end up in a conflict with. This kind of solidifies what I call the myth of the Black athlete. This social convention, and this is the beginning of it, that the accomplishments of Black athletes improve white images of Blacks, therefore bettering race relations. How do you measure race relations? Well, it was openly ambiguous for that reason. One of the things that happens to Jesse Owens in September 1936, when he returns to the Olympics, Jesse Owens is in the lead car of the ticker tape parade in New York City, which is the ticker tape parade for returning Olympians. And he's extremely celebrated in the mainstream press. He even appears on the front page of newspapers in the South in 1936, which is almost miraculous. The Richmond Inquirer or the Richmond World, for one, and another in Georgia. And I think if you understand how conservative Richmond and Georgia are on race at that time, you would consider it miraculous as well. Similarly, in 1938, Joe Louis is called a credit to the race, the American race, meaning that Joe Louis represents the United States. They're celebrated. And I point that out because it's at that time, between 1936 and 1938, that Black newspapers in particular begin to call for more Black athletes as a way of advancing the race. One particular athlete, Wendell Smith, and if you really study African-American sports history, you know Wendell Smith as the Black journalist that accompanied Jackie Robinson down to his first spring training and really did a lot of the prior work in battering teams to give Black athletes tryouts. In 1936, after the Olympics, Wendell Smith wrote, "It is without a doubt that the Negro athlete of today is doing more to help spread the goodwill throughout the world on behalf of his race than any other single individual. His exploits in the ring, on the gridiron, and on the track have done wonders in helping us lift ourselves up to the great place we are in American society." This was very common in the newspapers after that, after 1936 and 1938. So the convention is there, the convention is solid. There is a prediction that more Black athletes will further improve the image of the race and win Black people recognition of their citizenship rights. Now, that is contested, however. That is contested, however, by a number of different fronts. And I want to talk about the contestations because the contestations further make this social convention. One of the ways that it's contested is simply by white supremacy. As early as the 1920s, when you see the first Black athletes begin to challenge for national championships, there is these kind of arguments that take away from the meaning of the Black athlete. One of the arguments is that Black athletes succeed in sports is because they're more animalistic in instinct, that they have anatomically primitive bodies, especially in comparison to Caucasians. Excuse me, sorry about that. Especially in comparison to Caucasians. The impetus here is that they come from African ancestors who not long ago were running and jumping in the jungle, where life was, where doing so was a life and death matter. There were also these notions of scientific racism. Blacks supposedly possessed bones and legs in their feet and fast twitching nerves that were unique to Africans. Again, another kind of discussion about this, these anatomically primitive bodies. And then third, there was just what we would call Negrophobic minstrelsy. They commonly equated people like, Black boxers like Joe Louis to apes, and so just said that they were untamable by mere men. They were kind of superhuman. And so this kind of Negrophobic minstrelsy and also pseudotific science, it slurred the Black athlete. And so one of the things that would happen was you would have Black intellectuals and the Black media have to respond to this and expound on it. That was one of the contestations. A second contestation came from what we'll call the petty bourgeoisie of the Black middle class, or in other words, Black faculty and administrators at HBCUs. Now, since the founding of HBCUs, their mission, and I talked about this a little bit previously as it pertains to Black people, their missions were to cultivate the character, cultivate the moral character of its Black charges, to demonstrate that Black people were a civilized people. And through cultivating, say, their work ethic, their piety, and their morality, Black people would earn or improve their image, which would gain them favor in society. And so that was the mission of most Black colleges. And so this idea of cultivating athletes to demonstrate the manliness of the race, even though the United States was an imperialist nation and manliness was something that was supposedly required, was foreign or something unacceptable to many Black colleges. And so you had this debate go on in particular at the CIAA. And in many ways, I love this picture. In many ways, I don't. But this is at 1938 at the CIAA convention, 2 years after Jesse Owens. And what's significant about this picture in particular, not only are these Black college presidents and administrators, at this particular time, this is also a serious group in relationship to civil rights in Black America. Many of these men are executive officials in the NAACP on a local and state level, and in some cases a national level. Also things like the Urban League. They are also owners and executive in some of the largest Black businesses in America, including life insurance companies, funeral homes associations, etc. So I point all of that out to say that this in many ways is a who's of civil rights leadership in Black America. And at these conferences between, say, 1935 and 1940, they're discussing this question about what does the Black athlete mean to the Black struggle. And this question becomes so interesting, but also so contentious that you will also have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, George Streeter, who will also come or either send words to this conference to elaborate on this. So this is a significant question, and it's caused by how popular and how much press the accomplishments of Jesse Owens, the 1936 Olympians, and Joe Louis, how much their accomplishments make noise in the newspaper. Now, also at the conferences, you have a number of athletic coaches. And one in particular is James D. Parks, who runs the track team at Lincoln University, and they have a very formidable track team. And James D. Parks speaks for coaches, and he argues that HBCUs simply need to put more money into Olympic sports, that Joe Louis and Jesse Owens have done more for the race than any HBCU football team or basketball team ever had. And so that by developing more Jesse Owenses and more Joe Louises, you're advancing the race. And that's second by a number of other athletic officials, as well as newspaper people who attend the conference. But there's a response. College presidents make the case that improving the morality of Black people is way more important than cultivating masculinity. And so president after president at this conference, Arthur Howell of Hampton, John Grady of Virginia State, James E. Shepard of North Carolina Central, make almost this kind of biblical argument that people who don't have morality are doomed to fail. Shepard basically says the training students get from athletics should not only help them while in college and give them short-time notice, but should have a lifelong effect. So in essence, they shoot down this notion that the purpose of HBCUs is to develop the masculinity, right, of Black men, whether to participate in athletic service or military service to the nation. First and foremost, character matters most. Now, the other caveat is that schools, particularly predominantly white schools that were developing big-time athletic programs, had bad reputations. A number of athletes had been caught cheating. A number of athletes had received special economic subsidies. And Black schools far understood that they couldn't have those problems on their campuses and still receive money from their white benefactors. So in other words, it just wasn't worth the risk. So the educators carried the day at the CIAA, but even though they carried the day, the debate spurred the first all-out articulation of what I'll call the myth of the Black athlete. In 1939, 3 years after Owens won the Olympics, and 3 years after Owens won the Olympics, and 2 years after Joe Louis won the heavyweight title, Edward Bancroft Henderson basically condensed all their arguments in a book called The Negro in Sports. And in this argument, Henderson basically spelled it out. Henderson made this kind of civilization argument that basically said that it was the primal instinct of man to recognize the masculinity of other men. So even when racist white men watched the Black athletes, they found it thrilling and cheered for them, and that made them less racist, even if only for the moment or temporarily. And so what he did was point out all the examples of Black athletes who had participated in predominantly white institutions or environments and looked at the opportunities that they received as a result of that. One, of course, was William H. Lewis, his mentor, who played football at Harvard, was the first Black All-American. Eventually, Lewis became assistant attorney general under President Howard Taft. And basically, Henderson made the argument that Lewis would have never achieved that if he had not gone to Harvard and won the respect of many whites through football. And he pointed out a number of other examples. In other words, Henderson was saying cultivating masculinity through the Black athlete would eventually lead to integration, which by the late 1930s was seen as the key to the race problem in America. With the coming of mass integration in sports, right? And it would really would come for economic reasons and to a lesser degree, the Cold War. Henderson's theory became the theory to explain the popularity of Black athletes in American society. It became the dominant theory. David Wiggins, a historian, argues that over the next 6 or 7 decades, every good work or every similar work on the African-American athlete has relied on this theory. Simply that it is man's instinct to respect the masculinity of other men. So Black athletes are cheered even by racist white people because of that primal instinct, and sport has further integrated society. So that is the social convention. But what I will end by saying is that convention remains contested. As early as 1934, Richard Wright, the famous Richard Wright, and if you haven't ever read Richard Wright, he has a collection of commentary and essays. His novels can be a bit much, but his commentary and essays are brilliant. Richard Wright writes as early as 1934 that the masses of Black people, the everyday Black working class person, man and woman, love the Black athlete simply because they kicked the white athlete's butt. And that's what Blacks really wanted to do to end racism. They didn't want the burden of having to prove that they were moral or masculine. They simply wanted a straight up fight and to win, and that more than anything. And so that's one of the questions. that's one of the questions. Joe Louis and Jesse Owens were heavily celebrated in the mainstream press because of what they represented in America. But in Black communities, Joe Louis and Jesse Owens seem to be celebrated simply for beating white men. And that, more than anything else, was the most significant way to racial advancement. And so that meaning was often hidden in the commentary of the mainstream press, because that meaning meant that African Americans were surly and ungrateful about racism, which during the age of Jim Crow could bring more repression. So, in other words, this is why the social convention that athletes represent manliness and masculinity still continues to dominate today. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully I'll get some good questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackman, for the incredible presentation. You're welcome. It's amazing when you look at that picture of Joe Louis and Jesse Owens. Man, they were fly. I mean, they looked amazing, like so well dressed, so well heeled. And I love this thread of respectability politics that came through your presentation. And it kind of culminates in that picture. And it's interesting to hear the mission of HBCUs as articulated in the early years, and to remind ourselves that so many of those HBCU founders were white themselves, right? So part of the crafting of that language was an extension of some of the colonizing thoughts that had occurred. So thank you for pointing that out and bringing that into fruition. So now it brings us to the Q&A. So Tammye and Lacey, are we going to just jump back in and grab these questions from the audience? And are there any pre-questions we need to talk about? But I have a couple of questions for our guests before we get started. And this is for both of you, Dr. Young and Dr. Blackman. When you look at the correlation between 2020 activism and African-American athletes, how does that relate to just the representation of these athletes in Nazi Germany in 1936? When you look at 2020 last year in 1936, what comes to mind, and what are the similar threads that you see pulling through?
I can start. I think it's what I said. I think their very existence is resistance. And I think we forget that oftentimes because we think it's all about the sport and the athleticism without understanding that you being present, however you got here. And so that still is the same today. We still need athletes to shine a light on issues that perhaps other people may not be as aware of because they hold a certain cachet, not just only in the Black community, but in all communities. So just showing up, being there, and the fact that they give voice to some of these issues. And I want to mention, so Morehouse works with the NFL players and the NFL Player Coalition, and we help train them around social justice issues. And they talk about, the trade-off with standing up for an issue and some of the blowback that comes from that. And I think the same thing of those 18 Olympians, they had blowback by even participating or going to Germany. So just showing up, I think, is a form of resistance.
Yeah, I think Dr. Young said it perfectly. I think the context is a little different. Jesse Owens going into the Olympics was a national superstar already, perhaps maybe even international. But you see, even though his fame may have equated to what LeBron James's fame is today, the context was so different. Jesse Owens was utterly powerless, really, outside of athletics, whereas LeBron James kind of controls so much around him. And he even has social media to get his own message out. And I think sometimes we underestimate the impact of social media. And I'm sure he has, a couple of people working with him on social media. And so LeBron James could take some of the stances that he had that he has without and endure the blowback. I don't know that Jesse Owens could have taken certain stances and not have his career canceled. So I agree with just being in there. That's a form of resistance. But I also think historically the context that things like social media, the money involved, has allowed some Black athletes, not all of them, a degree of autonomy that previous generations of Black athletes just didn't have. And that allows them to speak out more, right? I think Muhammad Ali is an exception in the 1960s, but otherwise, I think, this generation just probably has a set of circumstances that allow them to speak out more than previous.
Thank you. We're going to ask one of the students who has his hand raised to come on video and ask his question, Raynell. Then I'm going to follow up with a question from Emma, who has a question for both professors. So Raynell, if you want to come on and ask your question, that will be great. We see your hand raised. In the interim, while you come on, I'm going to go ahead and toss the question from Emma to the professors. What do you think were the most prominent legal issues shown in the film that are no longer relevant today, but are also relevant today when you unpack kind of the legal issues and the political issues, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Young? And yeah. I would also ask you, not just the legal issues, but the economic issues and maybe the health issues as well, as in trauma.
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind, and I saw that question in the chat, and I don't know that I'll offer very much. One of the things that comes to mind, particularly from our reading, but also the film, I think people underestimate how difficult it was for many Black people, including Jesse Owens, to train to become an Olympian. When you know Jesse Owens' story, he comes from a very poor kind of Black neighborhood in Alabama. I think one of his parents is a factory worker. They come from the Jim Crow South as sharecroppers, and they just didn't have very much money. And even then, it took money to train. And so you read a lot of stories of Black Olympians, particularly prior to when a lot of people got endorsements. That's one of the big obstacles. And if you also know about the Olympics, they also, the Olympics, the USOC, or the American OC as it was called at that time, also often lack money to help athletes train or even send them to competition. So economically, just obtaining the money to train and travel, and then when you throw in the kind of racist and Jim Crow conditions that they face when traveling and accommodations, that seemed to be a huge issue. But money certainly for Jesse Owens. And I know a number of Black athletes just didn't like having to travel under segregated circumstances.
Yeah, I wish I could say that we've conquered many of the issues discussed in the documentary from 36. Unfortunately, we're still grappling with many of those issues, but I will say a semi-win has been Title IX, which is the amendment that is supposed to protect people from discrimination based on sex, which really did increase the number of women who participate in sports. So that's absolutely a win. But as we can see today, women's facilities are still not up to par. Women's professional leagues do not receive the same amount of funding and support. So we still have quite a ways to go, but we are seeing more women participate in sports, which is certainly a win.
When the Olympics were created, this was created for the elite. This was not created for the masses. So breaking through the construct of the origin story of the Olympics in itself is a feat, right? Because this was for the elite members of society. And you still see some sports retaining a level of elite and exclusivity where you don't actually see all members of the community being able to participate because facilities aren't near. There are lots of neighborhoods that may not have an ice rink. There are lots of neighborhoods that may not have access to water polo. There are lots of neighborhoods that may not have access to all of elite sports. So I think there's still a level of class and race and gender at play in 2021 when you look at all the fields that are open for competition. So go ahead, Tim.
I was going to ask a question. So, I wanted to also understand, and Dr. Young, maybe you can talk to this too, and Dr. Blackman, you had these athletes that were experiencing racism, Jim Crow laws, and everything that restricted them. They went over to Germany and they were treated almost as equals. They were mired, they ate beside their teammates, even on the 2-week cruise, so to speak, over to Germany. They were laughing and joking. We saw pictures of it. And, they won awards and medals when they were in the Olympics. They were heroes. But when they came back to the States, they were still the same Black people as when they left. So I wanted to kind of get an idea of what do you think they did to their mindset? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think about it quite a bit, even with the ride over, again, I said, this is one generation removed from slavery. So any reference to a ship would have been passed down from generations, their ancestors, their grandmothers arriving on a ship. So so in psychology, we call it, there's a cognitive dissonance that was most likely happening, where you're trying to understand the reality of a situation, even when there's evidence that supports something completely contrary. So there's this disparate view. So in one context, you're a hero, you're wearing the USA embroidered across your uniform, and you're good enough to be American then, but at home, you're not considered, you don't have the full rights of citizenship. Mm-hmm. So, most likely they were experiencing some cognitive dissonance, as we say. And, I'm sure therapy was not that, it wasn't as used as it is now, but boy, my hope is that the community embraced them. And I believe they did, because, even the story about Mac Robinson returning to Pasadena and getting the job as the street sweeper, where he wore his USA jacket. I mean, can you imagine? And not only what it did to the athletes themselves, but what did it do to others who were viewing the athletes? Because as Dr. Blackman said, these are hailed as our heroes. So what does it mean to participate on the world stage and come home? And there's nothing wrong with sweeping streets, but if that's the only job that you can get, what does it mean to be relegated to that?
Yeah, and even when Jesse Owens came back, he was the ultimate winner. And he thought when he came back to the States that he would be, invited into places that were, the doors were closed before, but that wasn't the case. I mean, he was trying to earn money by racing horses and getting people to come to view him in that way. So, it's a really tough thing that these athletes had to deal with. But, sometimes Jesse Owens, the athlete, but little was known about Jesse Owens, the person. Can you talk about that dichotomy, even Dr. Blackman?
I think Jesse Owens is, from the way that we look at it now, is a particularly sad story. He was a national hero. And when he came back, he thought that all these opportunities would be waiting for him. There would be Jesse Owens brands of this, that, and the other. He even got in trouble with the Olympic community at Ohio State and lost a scholarship for pursuing these economic opportunities. And it seems like most of them did not work out. So when I read books about Jesse Owens, there's a profound sadness to me. But part of that is also in the way that Jesse Owens saw himself in racial advancement. Jesse Owens really believed that his accomplishments somehow negated him being, negated that people would discriminate against him because he was Black. Jesse Owens profoundly believed that, it's almost the equivalent of of having a PhD or a JD or a medical degree that somehow separates us from other people. When in essence, that's just not true in the mind of a lot of other people. And so Jesse Owens relied on that for the rest of his life, that he somehow was going to be seen as better than the average Black and to be able to take care of and be able to have these opportunities. And so that led to a lot of disappointment into his life, but it also led to him being an example. One of the saddest things that you'll ever read about his life is that in 1968, when he went about trying to talk to the other Black Olympians about not boycotting, there was really a debate about his philosophy. And they didn't so much as call him an Uncle Tom as they said, how could you stand there after 30 years and make this argument and the Olympic community has never done anything for you? They simply dig you up every 4 years and take you to the games and say, look at Jesse Owens, but they've never given you a job. They don't give you opportunities along the way. Your family is starving because his wife had a number of medical issues. Your family is going through this and they don't even help you. So, Jesse Owens truly believed in this philosophy that somehow his accomplishments negated racism. And it just wasn't true. And so I think of that as an illustration of what also came out of Owens's experiences.
I think we forget something, and Dr. Young, you may be able to help us with that. We look at Jesse Owens in a lot of different ways, but there is a level of generational trauma that impacts Jesse Owens and the decisions that he made growing up where he grew up in Alabama, being transplanted as part of the Great Migration into Ohio, going to school there. So the generational trauma that impacts African Americans based on the movements and things that happen around our country really can contribute to how someone would think and how they would behave and how their whole life's trajectory could be kind of underpinned by that type of trauma. Is that an assessment that's relevant, Dr. Young?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we know that generational trauma exists. So this is the trauma that's either passed down from generation to generation, or it could be the trauma that one generation experiences that is passed down, not directly, but indirectly to their children. But there's also collective trauma as well. So we're talking about the 1930s, Jim Crow, lynching, we have all of these things going on. And I think to Ms. Jones's question, what are these athletes experiencing coming home? It's probably similar as to what the World War II vets and even World War I veterans were experiencing, where, a number of them were lynched in their uniform. So how is it that I am good enough to compete and fight for this country, but not good enough to experience what is my right, my human right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So I think Dr. Blackman speaks about that very well when he talks about Jesse Owens, but I think about all these athletes and just how heavy it must have felt to have that title of athlete and Olympian during that time period.
We have a little surprise. We have several of our HBCU coaches in the audience, and we want to promote them and put them on camera. So we want to shout out and show some love for our coaches who are raising our next generation of African-American athletes. So if our HBCU coaches will turn on their videos, we just want to say hello. We want to say thank you and also acknowledge the role that you play and also the challenges and obstacles that you face in doing that. So come on, Lacey's going to promote you to panelists so that we can see you. So join us. And while they join us, here looks like Coach Woodson's in the house. Yes. Please join us and introduce yourself, Coach Woodson. You're on mute. While we wait for Coach Woodson and to get off mute, I do want to ask the panelists two more. There you are, Coach Woodson. Great. Coach Woodson, you can introduce yourself. Maybe not. Okay. Well, we're happy to see you. We're happy to see you represent your university, and we're so grateful to have you join us. Dr. Blackman and Dr. Young, one of the things that we don't often see are Black coaches. We see Black athletes, we elevate Black athletes, but where in history are the Black coaches? Well, we know Grambling, we know the Tiger Bells coach, maybe those two coach, Eddie Robinson, Fritz Pollard, maybe. But what's the story of the Black coaches in America? I'm sure there are at least more than two.
Yeah, so when you look at it historically, it's part of this discussion that sport was integrated for economic reasons, right? So by the time you get to the 1940s, sports is so lucrative and it costs so much, particularly on a college campus, that you can no longer afford to pass up on a great athlete. You can't have half your football team be Black at Southern Cal, but you can certainly have the best Black athletes that you can find. And so when sports integrates, it's simply about, if you want to think about it in terms of labor, you have an untapped labor supply that can help you accomplish your goal of winning. But you don't need Black coaches. You need the best athlete. There's seemingly nothing wrong with your coaching. And if you're at USC, you want these Black athletes because UCLA and Berkeley are recruiting them, right? And so this remains the story really until, I'm going to say up until the 1970s. And this is kind of where some of my research goes, when people like Harry Edwards and Jesse Jackson make this a huge deal. And you see it begin to affect the way that some schools can recruit a bit, that by the time you get to the mid-1970s, there's a professor named Robert Greene at Michigan State University who kind of coordinates all the Black athletes at most of the schools in the Big Ten in the 1970s. And he gets the Big Ten to pressure their basketball and football coaching staffs to hire Black people. So again, most of us think that sports kind of integrated for altruistic reasons. After World War II, the Nazis exposed racism. And so people like Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby get their chance. When really, when you look at it hard enough, it's that people understand that you just can't pass up on great athletes anymore, Black or white, because they help you win. And winning attracts gate revenue, television revenue, radio revenue. So you have to have the best athletes, but you don't ever need the Black coach. And so if you don't have the kind of civil rights Black students movement invading sports in the 1970s, you probably still would have, I don't know what the numbers are today, but you would have at least half as less than you do now. So that's what it continues to speak to me, right? And at HBCUs, of course, you always had Black coaches, but outside of that, I don't think they've ever been a significant number anywhere.
Well, that's the perfect segue to hear from an HBCU coach, Coach Woodson. I think you just clicked it. You were off mute, and then you just clicked mute again. There you go. Now we can't get that audio going, Coach Woodson. I'm so sorry. So sorry about that. One of the things that's really, really important for us to think about and talk about coming out of your conversation, Dr. Blackman, is what is the plight of the Black coach? If the Black coach's existence is tied to the Black athlete, which is tied to the money, can a Black coach exist independent of the moneyed system of the NCAA as a historical figure and a hero? Now in 2021, Dr. Young and Dr. Blackman, if you can weigh in on that.
I just still think that Black coaches don't get the opportunities, and without opportunities, it's very difficult. Race is a factor in all of this. I think people are hired, and race still has a lot to do with who's hired and who's not. So when you don't get the opportunity, it's just hard to advance your career. And so I think, outside of the NBA, so one of the larger problems is that athletes are simply not organized well enough. If you had a kind of organized Black, and I'm not just talking about a protest movement, but I'm talking about any scholarship athlete could join an organization. for a number of different reasons, right? Because they're a group of labor, and so they deserve to be organized. But if they were organized better, they could make it more of an issue, and you would see more Black coaches get opportunities, particularly in men's basketball and football. So I just think it's a matter of opportunities, and that no one has basically forced the sports establishment to provide more opportunities for Black coaches. And until that happens, until you can get that first opportunity as a position coach, till you can get that first opportunity as a coordinator, you're not going to get that opportunity for head coach. In most cases, that's how things work. And so I just think we need to be better organized. You can have all the Black athletes you want, but if they're not going to put pressure on management or administration to make changes, I don't know that that's ever going to happen, because that's just the way the coaching establishment works.
Has the Rooney Rule worked?
I think it worked early on. I'm not sure that people agree that it's working to the degree that it should be working. And actually, some teams take fines rather than abide by the Rooney Rule. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys have done it twice, which shows you that the penalty for it not working may not be strong enough.
Because they'd rather take a fine than actually abide by the rule.
That they wouldn't phrase it that way, but they would say they knew what coach they wanted. So why interview everybody else?
Fair enough. We also have Coach Jackson. Coach Jackson, if you want to put your video on, Lacey's going to elevate you to panelist. Dr. Young, will you weigh in from your perspective from psychology and from perception and visibility and what that means for the future of Black coaches?
Sure. I mean, I actually really agree with Dr. Blackman that we forget that sports is an industry. It's a very lucrative industry. And there's been so much discussion this past summer about whether or not college students have the right to basically be paid as workers, which they are, and to be organized. And so there's been lots of debates around that. And I do think having more organization would really push the leadership in these organizations. But I think it even goes back beyond that as well. It's this idea that athletes are bodies, right? And so there's certain positions within sports that are the thinking positions. So we do see an underrepresentation of Black athletes, athletes of color, as quarterbacks, as leaders in their sport. And so that bias, that pre-notion that Black people aren't smart enough, which existed from eugenics, has carried over to today, that Black people cannot be in positions of leadership. And when they are, it's rare. So it's also dispelling those myths and those notions. And then, it gets to the organization piece and really making sure that we push people to make the right decision.
I want to just mention something about Coach Woodson for a second. We were talking about elite athletes. Coach Woodson was a major league lacrosse standout, right? Like your lacrosse standout. So he was one that was able to penetrate through these elite rungs. How many professional lacrosse players do you know that are African American? How many lacrosse players do you know? Period. But Coach Woodson was that. He was a standout at Brown. So he represents these incredible athletes that are able to maneuver through sports and get to the coaching rung, which is incredibly difficult to do when there's a lack of visibility on your sport and there's not a whole ton of television contracts and a whole ton of, brand contracts. So we definitely want to shout you out, Coach Woodson. I wish the crowd can hear from you. I don't know what's happening with the audio, but I wanted to personally thank you for being here and thank you for being a standout in lacrosse. Thank you for being a standout at Brown and raising the next generation of Black athletes. So here's to you. We want to give you flowers while we can see you and let you know, great job all the way around. And if you want to post your schedule in the chat so we can make sure we're catching, if we're nearby, we can catch any games you have, support you, buy tickets, whatever we need to do to make sure that your program stays strong, we'll do that. Thank you. Are there any additional questions that we've left out? And meanwhile, I'm still going to work really hard to figure out why we can't get Coach Woodson to just hear his voice once.
If I could just jump in, Deborah, and I just wanted to say to everyone that Deborah Riley Draper is awesome. And she's doing a lot of great projects. She has a wonderful team that she's working with, and Lacey Barnes is one of them, is the COO of Coffee Bluff Pictures. But we have to support people like Deborah. I've talked about in the introduction the number of projects that she's working on. But besides congratulating her, we need to support her financially. We need to buy her books. We need to go see her films. We need to support her in any way possible. We had the link to purchase her book during registration and also on the chat. So you can buy books for yourself. You can buy books for your family and friends and get the word out and spread. We have a great network with us, with our people. So let's continue to promote the wonderful projects that Deborah and her team are doing. And let's just try to lift her up, because she is an entrepreneur. And entrepreneurs don't survive just on accolades. They survive on funds and getting different projects and exposure. So I just wanted to say that about Deborah and her team.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's critically important. If we look at the turn of the last century, there's a level of cooperative economics in our country, in our Black communities, in our Black business districts, that were tantamount to those districts surviving. So we can borrow a little bit of that philosophy around cooperative economics and make sure we continue to not only buy my book, but Professor Blackman's book.
Yes.
Encourage people to, and if you know young students who are interested in African American history, encourage them to literally pick up the phone, call Dr. Blackman and say, I want to be in graduate school at Morgan State and get a master's degree in African American history. Because he is like a coach, he's recruiting African American history scholars. And so he's trying to get, what is the equivalent of a D1 team of intellectual kids over there at Morgan State. So he is working on that. And I think they're coaches in all realms. They're coaches in lacrosse, they're coaches on the scholar side. And both Dr. Young and Dr. Blackman are raising the next generation of scholars and people who think about our community in really smart ways that will help us not only elevate and preserve our history, but create a future, which is equally as important. So let's think about, as we wind this up, cooperative economics and supporting all of our community has. And we thank the links. And Tammye, you had this brainchild to be able to use a film for public discourse. And it's really a great way to think about how we have conversations, and a great way to inspire conversations and inspire actions, because we can physically see what was done before we were even on this planet. We can physically see what it looked like 80 years ago through the work of Leni Riefenstahl, the filmmaker from 1936, and take that and help us think about the future. So huge thanks to you, huge thanks to the links, huge thanks to the HBCUs. Now we're gonna try something in order to get a picture. I don't know if this is gonna work, but we want all of our HBC student athletes and our students to come on the screen right now so we can see your faces, so we can thank you for supporting, and everyone for supporting this program, supporting the link, supporting Dr. Young, Coach Woodson, and Dr. Blackman for all the work that they do to support our community. So let's keep your mute on, but take your video off and so we can see you. All right, everybody, let's try it. Let's see if we can make it work.
And Deborah, before we leave, I do want to say one more thing. So I want to say that after we see all these handsome faces and beautiful faces come up. So hopefully they'll come on.
I think Lacey's helping them come on right now.
So let me just go ahead and say this then while they're working on that, if that will work with the schedule. So I agree. So thank you so much for everyone for this awesome opportunity to come together to talk about this film and the issues that surround this film. So also with this film, we have expanded this to a song competition. So it is a competition for students, the HBCU students, to participate to create an original song and the content will be based on the film. It will celebrate Black athletes and the achievements of these Black athletes. So this is a song competition. There's certain criteria that are going to be used to grade or to evaluate the song. And the music or band directors on campus are going to be used as resources, and the songs are going to be submitted through them and then through them to me. So I just wanted to say it's any genre of music, whether it be R&B, hip hop, whatever it is. And you don't have to have a big band to support you. I have a friend whose son creates music. He uses all beats from online. So it could be something as easy as that. The song can be no longer than 3 minutes. And I want to also announce that we have an awesome panel of judges, and I want to tell you who they are. The first one is Kenny Vaughan. He's a writer-director for Sesame Street, and he participated in the soundtrack for Boomerang. And that was the awesome movie a couple of decades ago featuring Eddie Murphy, Halle Berry, and Robin Givens. We also have Anthony Little at DMOA. He's a producer at EMF Recording Group. He has worked with Grammy and received Grammy recognition with P. Diddy, Faith Evans, and Lauryn Hill. Thirdly, we have Dr. Ashley Jackson, who's a highly sought after orchestral harpist who has appeared on stages around the world, including Alice Tully Hall in New York, Carnegie Hall, Royal Opera House in Muscat, Oman, and the National Center of the Performing Arts in Beijing, China. And lastly, we have Eric Pryor, the CEO and president of the renowned Harlem School of the Arts. And he's also an accomplished painter, but he works a lot with the young students, not only academically, but artistically. So the winners, this is the official kickoff today, and they have until April 22nd to submit their songs. Winners will be announced on May 3rd, and the first place winner will win $400, and the runner-up will receive $200. So I just wanted to announce that. Any questions, please reach out to me.
Congratulations. I did not say, I want to make sure I said it correctly, that lacrosse, Coach Woodson has the only Division I HBCU men's lacrosse program in the United States of America. Just
wow.
To make sure that we understood the stat on that. The only one in the United States of America. So definitely when lacrosse season comes back, we want to make sure we check that out because that's going to be fun. So post-COVID, we can check out some lacrosse.
Yes.
All right. So it looks like folks are coming on. We're going to try to get a great picture in the next 2 minutes. Any final words? We're going to just ask for 30 seconds of final words from Dr. Blackman and Dr. Young. So Dr. Blackman, please, your final recap of the afternoon and of the morning. You're on mute. I think we're like weird all on mute in some ways except me. So I don't know if we can get the final words or not. Dr. Young, let's try.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you again to the organizers, Ms. Jones, to the Links of Essex County, to you, Deborah, and to Lacey and all the folks who came out to learn a little bit more, take a deeper dive. Tell someone about what you learned from the documentary. Get the book. The book is a feast. I so enjoyed reading it because I learned so much. And these are stories that really need to be shared. So share them with someone, tell someone about them. You're going to look smart in front of all of your friends because you're going to know these historical facts that not many people know. So get the information out. And then also remember that, showing up is a form of resistance. Mm-hmm. And the one last thing I do want to say, we are witnessing a trial right now that is going to have huge implications and it's going to be historic. Everyone just really take time to take care of yourself because I think, we also are experiencing a collective trauma around that too. So we really need to be mindful about that and take care of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I'm going to grab this picture of all of you. And on behalf of everyone who put on this program. We thank you for your participation. We thank you for your cooperation. And please definitely take care of yourself and stay safe. Here goes. I think I have. There. Thank you. You guys have a great evening and be safe. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.